So welcome to the fifth in our series of creative practice research webinars hosted by the Mexico Practice Network and Solent University. My name is Roy Hannay. I'm employed by Solent University where I run the media course and I have some responsibilities for research and knowledge exchange. And today's conversation comes out of a lot of questions that I get from people when I'm dealing with, often with people in our research office, or I'm dealing with people who perhaps come from a more, shall we say, traditional research background, and I'm talking about the projects I do or research funding or anything like that, and they say, well, what's your question? You need to start with a question, Roy. And my experience is that I actually rarely start from a position of a clear question, and that for me the practice is all about exploring, sometimes quite playfully. And I can think of a couple of examples where clear questions have come out of the research, out of the practice. But this can be quite challenging for people who are not who don't necessarily work in more experimental or creative areas of research. So when I came across Annette's writing about speculative research and creative practice, I was like, oh, this is a conversation we really need to have. So I'm going to hand over to Annette and I invite her to introduce herself, and then we will proceed. We've got some questions to talk through. As I say, if you've got any questions or comments, please put them into the chat and we will try and pick them up at the end. And if we could just have mics off while we're doing the recording, that would be brilliant. Oh, that is a good point. Everyone should be aware this is being recorded. It will be put up on the Practice Network YouTube at the conclusion of today. So, Annette, welcome. Thank you very much for your time. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us all about what you do and who you are?
All right, if not all, then something. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor. And I'm Annette Arlander, based in Helsinki. I also spend a lot of time in Stockholm. I'm visiting researcher at the University of the Arts, Helsinki, the Fine Arts Academy there. But I did my doctorate in the Theatre Academy based in performing arts in 1998, last century. I'm technically retired now, but I'm still a visiting researcher. I was formerly professor of performance art and theory, and also some time artistic research, as we call it in the Nordics. My current artistic research project, or actually the one that is just finished that I'm writing about and still making videos of and so on, is called Pondering with Pines. So you understand why I'm interested in speculation, because if you want to have conversations with pine trees, you have to allow for things not happening in the same way as conversations with humans. But to say briefly, I'm not an expert on speculative research. Why the text that Roy came upon is a small network text. It's not a peer-reviewed text. It's a small network text online for the journal, in the Journal for Artistic Research network section, one of the first texts. And it was a response to the idea that artistic research is speculative research. And I was claiming that no, artistic research is speculative practice. So that's my coming to this. Maybe that's enough.
That's a really interesting kind of definition there, and I specifically have started adopting the sort of term creative practice research, because I find all of the practice as research, research-led practice, all of these different categories are kind of they're sort of a bit distracting. What we do as creatives is practice, but when we do it within academia, there is a desire to articulate it as research as well. And so that's why I use that term, so that we kind of say, well, it is practice, but in our context, it's also research. Is that, would you recognize that as a definition?
Of course. But I'm talking now about the speculation, because when, of course, we can think of the word speculation meaning many things. I mean, you can speculate with money, or there is speculation. But there are also people sort of speaking very seriously about speculative fiction. And at the time, there was the Meillassoux in philosophy, Meillassoux speculative realism, and so on. So, but generally, speculation is something that happens in your mind. So it's you sit down and sort of start to speculate. But I thought that no, I go out in the bushes and start to speculate, or I go into the studio and speculate. So that's what I mean by that the speculation is not something that happens sort of separate from the doing, but it is actually by doing things repeatedly, I'm sort of allowing for something to maybe happen. Or,
it seems to me that what you're talking about is something that is fundamentally experiential.
Sure.
Right. Would it be appropriate to say it's experiential, not experimental?
Well, as an artist and as an old artist, I like to keep sort of the idea of experimental art alive. There was a time when people said that the only way that the experimental art will survive is by going into the academia and sort of allying itself with research and so on. But I understand, as you mentioned, and many people, that when we speak of experimental research, then we start to think of the sciences and the controlled laboratory situations where you try to keep all the other you have only one aspect that you want to have changing, and all the other aspects should be constant in order. So the controlled situations, and in like real life in art, this is not possible. So that type of, or of course you can make, some people do make experiments. For instance, trying to find the right way of coloring some textile. You can do that. I'm not saying that, but for my practice, it's not experimental in the scientific sense.
I always like to think of the arts practice that I do as archaeological is not quite the right term. There is a sense that you're kind of almost dusting away things to get at what it is that you're doing, but actually there is a much more that doesn't feel like a building metaphor. So when very often I find that what we're doing is building towards a concept rather than sort of dusting away. But at the same time, it feels a bit more like an archaeological process, one of discovery and surprise and happenstance. Is that something that you would recognize?
Well, I recognize it maybe in some of my colleagues' work, but not so much in my own, because I work so much with repetition. So I sort of set up, what's it called? It's a sort of, for instance, with time-lapse videos, it's not real time-lapse, but I set up a situation and then I repeat and repeat and repeat. But that situation has the possibility for chance to intervene or things to happen. And by repeating it, I somehow invite something to happen. So it's but I know my way of making art or making research is not what every artist does. So the interesting thing is, of course, the relationship between, if I jump a little bit, maybe the relationship between question and method. Because in a way, many artists start with some sort of questions, but they are questions like problems that get you going. You're not supposed to even answer them. They're just something to inspire you to get going. Or like Bas Kershaw used to say that you have a hunch. of something, and then you go. But and then you might sort of sharpen that or narrow it down into a research question while you're working, when you sort of realize what you're doing. But the problem is often that what is the relationship between your practice and the question? Because not all, how should I say, most artists have a practice, they have their method. So you have to choose the question so that it fits your method. Normally, you would have a question. You know, a scientist might have a question, and then they would choose their methods. But as artists, many of us have our methods. And then we have to choose, what kind of questions can I find an answer to with these methods that I use?
That's interesting, because I actually one of the things that I find is that's actually quite hard, because having engaged in the practice, there are 100 questions that you could then dive into, and sometimes sometimes the question that you end up doing is kind of a bit, or I find this, the question that I end up then looking at and developing in perhaps a more theoretical way tends to be quite abstract and philosophical for me. Is that how do you find that you end up in quite an abstract philosophical kind of understanding of your work through the practice?
Yes and no, because I like philosophy, so I'm more like not as bad as some of my colleagues, but I sort of, it is my fuel. I get inspired by philosophical ideas, and it's harder for me to contextualize my work with what other artists do, because I might get inspired by artists, but then it's a technical thing. Oh wow, there is an image inserted in another meme. I could do that, and the topic has nothing to do with it. But there is like, if ideally I would like to just think that the investigation is in the practice, and then I could only report that this and this and this is what I did find, and this was the problem, and this didn't work as I thought, or this didn't, and that would be enough. But of course I also theorize, especially when somehow, and this is not suitable for everybody, but I like it when there is a call to a conference, and suddenly it's about, all right, the theme is now tragedy. What the hell? What does it have to do with my work? But then I can ask a question for my work. Okay, so what's tragic in this encounter with the pine tree? Well, of course, pine trees are cut down in Finland every day in such masses that it's like mass murder. But so there is a lot of tragedy and so on. But ideally, this idea that you first make the practice and then start asking questions from that practice, it's not the ideal model for sort of artistic research, because it makes you like, first you're an artist and then you're a researcher.
I find that while I'm while I'm doing the practice, I kind of probably read more philosophy when I'm doing the practice than I do afterwards, and I find that they kind of feed each other. And that actually something will happen in the practice that makes me go and find something or do some reading, and then that feeds back. So there is a sort of a bouncing between the two positions, the practice and the research, and that it's difficult to tease them apart in my mind. Is that something that you feel?
Yes, except that that's why I insist on the practice, that I think I'm just as much or even more researcher when I go to the bushes and talk to the pine tree than when I sit and write about it at home or read philosophy. So I dislike the idea that it's the theoretical part that is the research. I think it's the practical. That's why I like the idea of experimental also. You try it out. It's like the trial and error part, like artistic work as a method. But
Okay.
of course, and that's very much used by pedagogues and social scientists and so on. And then the artist in me says, yes, but artwork can also be the result. It's not only that we are the method, that it's very good to have workshops with artists, and artists produce a lot of data. We gather a lot of material when we make our works. Yes, that's true. Art practice is a great method for many things, but art can also be the result.
Yes, and I think that certainly in the UK, it's being much more recognised that art can be the result. Although there is still, like when we do the research excellence framework, they still want you to write about it, and tell them how is articulate that. So there are still challenges from that. But I guess even if you go to a gallery and see some artworks, there are still those statements that are there with the artwork. And an artist friend of mine a long time ago made a claim, whether this is substantiated or not. He said that it was the little plaque with the statement that made it art. Do you agree, disagree? Where do you stand with the written side of that articulation?
Made it art or made it research? I think today, well, there was a time when I said there's a problem, because artists are used to the idea that I say this is art, that means it is art. So if I say this is research, it should be enough also, and it's research because I say it's research. But when it's research, you need to have it confirmed by somebody else. And nowadays also you need somebody other than yourself to confirm that they consider it art too, a curator or a gallerist or a theater producer or whatever. So it's the intention of the statement is not enough. Now we came on a sidetrack, maybe.
Yeah, well, yes. Well, we started to get into talk a little bit about how we articulate what we do as artists and creatives as research. And I think that there is a sense that the practice is the work, is the research, and that stands on its own. But when we're in academia, we also get asked to articulate it as well. And I think that that's one of the challenges, certainly a big challenge for practitioners coming into academy and teaching, and starting to think about their practice in this new context where we're saying to them, well, you're also a researcher. That's where that challenge about articulating what you're doing as research in text starts to become another skill set. It feels like an additional skill set, something that is perhaps being asked for that isn't necessarily inherent in the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we speak of there are all kind of hybrid forms, but if we speak of research, that's trying to find out something. And not all artists are always trying to find out something. On the contrary, you might want to give an impression of something, or you want to make a statement, or you might want to just create an experience for people, I don't agree at all that all art is research. I know very well that I can sometimes do artistic practice, and it's not like looking to find out something. So this idea that and then there is the problem of ambiguity. And I think the explanation, the written part is good, because then the artwork might still have some possibility for ambiguity. Because you want good art to be somehow ambiguous. You can't sort of have a bomb, bomb, bomb. But then the statement can sort of clarify. I think it's very different in different art forms. But if you think of a large stage performance and you investigate some aspect of that, you can't investigate everything in an artwork. So then of course, the audience can enjoy the whole artwork, but then the people who want to look at it, the research part of it, they need to have some specification that, all right, the research here went into the sort of footwork, or the research here went into the sort of use of colors in the scenography, or, you know, so it's, I think
that's really interesting. And while you were talking, I started to think about the text as I like the idea you were saying that the work needs to remain ambiguous, but what the text does is it anchors an aspect of the making, the producing, the practice in relation to a specific research topic or inquiry.
Yeah, that's one possibility. There are so many. The problem is that, in a way, because, and that's the beauty, because art is so multiple. There are so many different ways of making art in different forms of art, and also individual artists. So the challenge is to sort of find in what way my way of practicing can be utilized as a method or as a result in what kind of questions, for what context. So that's why the question is, of course, important, because what question you ask, that places the whole thing in sort of some context related to other questions.
But are we still talking about, a question that starts from perhaps an intuitive space and moves into maybe a more articulated form, but evolves and changes, or which is, to me, is very different from the idea that you start from a question and then go develop a methodology and go off and do something? Are we talking about a question that is perhaps sort of fluid through the process?
Well, but then at some point, it's like, how should I say? At some point, you have to decide where you put the work. I mean, I've moved from theater through performance art, through radio to video. And at some point, I could sort of, how should I explain it? What is the discussion that you want to bring your work to? What is it? What is the heap of knowledge that you want to contribute to? And that's the problem, because then you have to formulate the question partly so that it has some relevance for the field where you place your work in. For some artists, this is not a question, because they're so in their own field that that's what it is. You know, it's ballet is ballet is ballet. But that's a bad example, because there is so many. But I don't know. So this idea in what order you, how late in the process you somehow specify the question, it depends.
So that brings us to one of the questions that we kind of talked about before the conversation, around uncertainty, and whether uncertainty is a strength, or how does speculative practice relate to the principle of uncertainty?
Well, uncertainty is a little bit like unknowing. There was a tendency when every artist wanted to focus on unknowing and uncertainty. Artists are very good at tolerating uncertainty. I think that's a real strength for many art. Not everybody, because we're all different, but most artists tolerate uncertainty very well. But I think even more important than sort of keeping everything open and in the air and sort of keeping everything open is to take advantage of mistakes. You know, so the uncertainty is to not only to tolerate the fact that everything is up in the air until the very end, but to have the capacity to see, oh wow, that was not planned at all, but let's go there. And that might, yeah. I wish I was better with that myself, because I keep on doing the same thing so long.
I'm a big fan. The work I do it tends to be quite large scale, complex stuff, and part of the method is to end up doing things that were totally unexpected, that weren't planned. And it's quite challenging for people working on a project. So, and we have a sort of a bit of a mantra is like trust the process. The process generally has worked, but it can be quite scary. Some people don't really like going into that space. They want to know what's happening. But for me, if you don't have that open field for uncertain, unexpected things to happen, then you will miss opportunities. And I guess is that a speculative method?
Well, it could be, but I must say that of course it's very different if you work with a group of people or if you work alone, because it's very easy to say that you need to tolerate uncertainty when you actually need to tolerate that I decide what we do. You understand, if I simplify now. But of course, speculation means that you don't know. Speculation is that we make this experiment, we try out this thing, and then we may try this thing, and let's see. So I think the word "what if" is, what if we would turn this upside down, or what if we could talk to a pine tree? You know, the speculation, it doesn't have to be like that you try everything, but there is this scientists sometimes call it blue skies research, that you just start wondering, why is this like this?
I mean, I find that I guess this is probably an axiom of mine, is that creativity exists in relation to a problem to solve. And problems can be various things. They can be, I feel like doing something that sets up a gap, because obviously I want to do that thing. I have to get there, might have to learn how to do it or whatever. So I'm not a big fan of completely blue sky thinking, because I don't find that triggers my creative process, as it were. I like to things, very often I'll have a text or something, and I say, well, this is the text we're going to work with. And certainly working with a group of people, everyone will have a different response to that. And so that starts to sort of percolate up ideas and things, and that dynamic is obviously one of the filters that through which we kind of speculate as a way, I guess. So I much prefer to have a problem to start with, but is a problem different from a question?
Well, you could even have a research task. I think it's for me it was a big realization to understand that not all kinds of questions can be answered through art practice. For instance, why questions. If you ask, why is it that this and this happens, it's very difficult to find an answer. Well, you can, but it's difficult to tackle that question through practice. But how questions, or would it be possible to, or how could I approach trees as subjects, or when I did my first research work before my doctorate even was making 10 variations of the same play in different venues, and my first question was, how does space influence a performance? Well, it's like, how does the earth influence life? It's like too big question anyway for any research. But of course, I very quickly understood I can't sort of, this is too big. So my question was actually, how can I use space when creating a performance? And then I could show examples of how I can use space, both as relationships between performer and spectator, and as place with the meaning. I don't remember. This was in the 90s. But you know, it's really important with the question, because there was somebody who told me that actually you should rewrite your research question every week. Because I've never done that, but you know, what am I trying to find out?
Yeah, I think that is good piece of advice. I think I have a feeling that that's probably what we do, but we do it more intuitively or tacitly. We don't necessarily sit and rewrite it, but that inquiry, certainly for me, that inquiry shifts and changes through the practice, that it kind of grows or meanders, or sometimes just goes off on wild tangents. And to me, that is why practice or creative practice brings something different than the scientific experimental method, is because I guess it embraces that idea of uncertainty. Can we ask you a little bit about documentation, because it seems this is increasingly something I've started to see and look at as a vital part of any creative practice, but certainly if you are doing a more speculative approach, would you say that documentation has a specific role to play in that process?
I'm a big fan of documentation, partly because my whole artistic practice developed from documentation. So from working as a theater director, you know, traditional theater director, what could I do on my own? Then I started, well, I did some performance art also, but the whole development of sort of doing performances on my own outdoors with a camera on tripod, documenting them. And I still thought for many years that I'm actually doing performances and this is only documentation. Well, since 15 years, I know now that I make video work. So I moved through documentation. My whole practice moved. But that's my part of it. But very different practices. Some people, especially in performing arts, are very much afraid of documentation. Whereas then, or representation. Whereas in other fields, documentation is like, if you make film, of course. I mean, everything is, or if you draw, you document. But in the Norwegian artistic research program, there has been a seminar for many years, the second seminar in the start, which is all about documenting. And I would say that it's important to realize that not only to document the final work, because most artists know today that you have to document the final work. You have to be able to sell it. You have to be able to put it in your portfolio. The final work needs a documentation, and that will be like glossy and elegant and all that. But for research purposes, what you need to do is to document the process and document the side tracks. And to decide how you document, how do you, in what is the best way to document? It's not only to keep all the material, but are you keeping a diary, or are you doing as a colleague of mine who was a sound designer, he took a photograph of his working table every day when he finished job. The documentation was what happened to the instruments that he were building and so on. Or a writer who didn't want to mess up with language because he was writing a play, he started to use a dictaphone for his journal diary and so on. I think documentation is sometimes the first step from artists. If you're an artist with no experience of research ever, just start to document your process and look at how you're actually working to be able to articulate your practice as a method. That would be my advice.
That kind of links into this idea, perhaps, and this is a question, is that an autoethnographic approach to research? I mean, I'm wondering, having created all this archive of documents, is that the subject of the research, or is researching that a different practice?
Well, it depends, because I still think it might be for somebody, it might be that you're just documenting the process, and then you start asking questions, looking at your data. You produced a lot of data, as they say in ethnography, and then you start looking, what can I get out of this? That's one possibility. I prefer to think of the actual practice as the speculation, because I repeat and repeat and repeat in order for magic to happen in that moment. But that ethnography, for a scholar, you can explain that, yes, creative practice research or performance as research methodology or artistic research method can resemble autoethnography. But if you're not trying to contribute to ethnographic discourse, then I wouldn't call it autoethnography. It resembles methodologically, but because we've had, with colleagues, we've had some courses in auto theory and autoethnography and auto fiction, and they all are different depending on where they want to use their auto, where they put themselves. The self is contributing to fiction, or the self is contributing to ethnography, or the self is contributing to theory. It all comes down then where you put your work.
Where you place yourself in relation to the work. Is that what we're talking about here? Depends on how
where you place the result.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because I guess that context of where you place it is kind of comes back to this whole idea of placing creative practice in academia, doesn't it? Which is
right, exactly. But then there is the whole, especially in fine art, but artistic research is super interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. So it can be a real mixture of different perspectives. It's a
well, that's a really good segue into the next question, because I think you've talked about how artistic practice or research is a.
Where are we now?
Well, the question is, how does it foster interdisciplinary insights? Is it sort of an exemplar of how to do that, or is there something specific about it which promotes that interdisciplinary practice of thinking?
Well, I came across it. Now it's more like self-evident, but it used to be like a critique that artists are only cherry picking. They're not sort of committing to anything, deep thinking, or to any scholarly legacy or tradition. They're just cherry picking interesting ideas and mixing them at will. And this cherry picking of interesting ideas and mixing them at will can also be a great asset. Because in an artist's work, things can meet that would meet nowhere else in the world. You can combine knowledge of like Egyptian mummies and weeds on the Irish coast and pine tree. The combinations that can happen within an art practice are.
Is there something about hybridity?
But let me say another example which comes closer to your practice, maybe the way of combining people. So it doesn't have to be. It used to be that artists were taken into big interdisciplinary projects. So we have these social scientists and we have these archaeologists, and then we have an artist to keep us happy and so on. But artists can also invite collaborations with other areas and have them contribute in a very sort of So both in the sense of mixing topics, but also mixing people. Oh, and I forgot the main point. Actually, what instead of interdisciplinarity, I have now my new favorite word is undisciplinary.
Oh, disciplinary.
And that comes from Taru Elving, a curator. So it's not, I haven't invented it, but I think it's a perfect, because it means that it's some artists' practice doesn't fit into any discipline. So it's between all kinds of discipline. It's not only interdisciplinary, but it's undisciplined, because it's sort of weird. But then it can also be a little bit undisciplined. like like artists sometimes can be.
I think I get it. I mean, I've often said that resistance is a creative act,
Also,
and I think that there's something about undisciplinarity, which is resisting. That is resisting some the sort of constraints of silos and categorization, and that's perhaps that one of the things that. So you were talking about bringing these things together, and one of the things that about hybridity is that it can spark new things that were unexpected, in a sort of maybe alchemical way, to sort of use maybe an undisciplinary sense of doing making things.
but of course, undisciplinary, besides being undisciplined, that is unruly, or what you would a little bit sort of, it can also mean that it's sort of useful for many disciplines, if you understand. So it's not linked to it's not sort of labeled with this, that this is ethnography.
Yeah.
But it's a,
so let us move on to a question about speculative freedom versus institutional expectations, which is sort of threaded through what we've been talking about. And how do artists and as creative practitioners in an institutional setting, how do you kind of balance those institutional requirements of ref and writing research statements and kind of writing up and producing? I've just had a conversation this week about how we're going to package up all of this practice and evidence it as research for these ref panels who say we can only look at 3 minutes worth of material per item. You know, so how do you, as a creative practitioner, sort of balance those institutional expectations?
well, we don't. I don't have experience of ref in the sense, but I think the thing is very different when you work with a PhD, and then when you work with research projects, because the control of a PhD is sort of that it really has to fit the institutional requirements. But the research project, their results, of course, you have a research plan, and then the funder expects that you will work along that plan, but it's not controlled in the, or it's controlled like how many peer-reviewed publications, or you know, but it's not so. Yeah, I don't have experience of ref, but I guess it's overall this whole idea that you make creative practice and then afterwards you somehow frame it as research, that creates problems. So
I agree. I agree absolutely, and I guess part of the journey for me, in terms of my own practice and understanding my relationship to those institutional expectations, is trying to figure out how you go into the practice with that mindset of practitioner researcher, and quite what that mindset is. And I think that for me, one of the things is that idea of being able to sort of be speculative, to engage with uncertainty, but also to document everything. I think
exactly.
I've really learned this.
And I remember, I'm not going back to sort of my problems with research when I began and so on, but I remember a conference in Canada where there was a woman. This is many, many years ago. Was talking about her research with intelligent textiles, and she was like, "If it works, it's no longer cutting edge." And I was like, "Yeah." So as an artist, you're normally you're supposed to succeed because you want to yeah, you want to make a great artwork and you want to impress the audience and you want to, there is no alternative that it doesn't work, especially in performing art. It has to work. It's in front of the audience.
Yeah.
But when you allow yourself the mindset that this is, what if we do like this? What if it's a catastrophe? Might be. So I remember when I made some performances that were just catastrophe. A friend, a choreographer of mine said, "Well, but this is a great research result. This way it doesn't work." All right. So in a way, this to use the possibility of research to let loose of the need to succeed that artists have. I think there is a lot of exaggeration for that you need to. There's so much pressure for output. Most artists that I know of, they have no problem in having output if they don't want to make the masterpiece.
Mm-hmm.
Most artists, they keep on working all the time. They produce all the time. So it's just to somehow accept that it doesn't have to be that one. Well, this is easy to say because there are many ways of working that are really expensive, that you can't work at all if you don't get the funding and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I've invented a way of working where I don't need so much money to be able to work, so I can produce more than what they want me to do.
That is a good place to be. I have to say, I'm just writing up the report for the last thing I did and wondering whether I can scale it down and find a way of doing things without the need for funding. Annette, I'm going to pause at this stage and invite people to put some questions in the chat, or if you want to, just open up your mic and ask a question. Anyone out there who would like to ask a question, do go ahead.
Or come with a protest, because
Yeah,
questions
indeed.
are not always
So,
ready there.
Henry says, I'd love to hear your thoughts on agency and speculation. For example, how you consider the expressive agency of the pine tree within your research gathering speculative practice. So, yeah, the agency of the pine tree.
Yeah, that's I've actually written about it quite a lot. There is a new journal called Plant Perspectives, and after much struggle and much rewriting, I had a text published there. And with where I speak a little bit about this, in what ways the pine tree has an sort of contributes to the recordings. And of course, one is by the pine decides the site. The pine very much has agency in deciding where I am placed in relationship to the pine. They also partly decide the place for the camera, but especially they decide the topics that we discuss. And I mean, this is all. Besides that, I'm not using any technology to get any electric impulses from the pines or something. I trust on the volatile chemicals that I breathe in and breathe out. It's a long story, but it's difficult to. That's why I need the speculation, because I'm not really sure how the pine tree influences my thoughts when I sit there. I only know, I have a hunch that it does. And one way is to think of it through Stacy Alaimo's idea of transcorporeal exchanges, because there are like all kinds of waves and minerals and everything are exchanged. Or another way would be to think like literary scholar Patricia Vieira, who speaks of inscription, that all living beings inscribe themselves in their environment. So the pine tree is perhaps inscribing themselves into my presence there, and so on. So yeah, this was not maybe a complete answer to your question, but but there certainly is there is a problem. There is agency, and there is a problem of articulating that agency.
That's very interesting. I've read a lot recently about how trees communicate with each other through the biome, through fungus, through the air. I see no reason why we couldn't presuppose that they are communicating with us, or at least trying to. Maybe we, as per your practice, we need to listen. Any other questions? Annette, is there anything that you would like to share on this topic that you feel, especially thinking about early career researchers, people who, and very often for me, those are people who are practitioners in one way or another in a creative field. They're very often new to academia. What advice or tips would you give to them?
One, don't be scared. It's like I tried to. When I was studying art history, there were footnotes in classical Greek, and do I have to learn this to understand this? And went to a course. No, you don't have to learn everything, but you have to accept that you need to learn things. Don't be afraid, just learn. Second, try to explain to other people how you work, because trying to explicate how you work, it's really difficult. It's like trying to explain how you're riding a bicycle, because it's part of you already. But to try to explain how you work and write that into a method. And then the third is, what kind of questions can you tackle with that method?
I think that's really interesting, and I think that's a really good way to conclude, is to say that practice is it's embodied. It's not it's purely intellectual. It's something that infuses us as a being. It's the academy that wants us to articulate it. But if we want to exist within the academy, we have to learn how to do that, perhaps.
And it won't hurt us to try to understand what you're doing. It's not hurting you.
Exactly. And that is perhaps where the research in creative practice research lies, in trying to understand what it is we do.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to say thank you now, Annette. It's been a really interesting conversation. I've learned a lot from it. And I now want to do another conversation with another person, because these conversations have been really fascinating. Thank you to the audience for being here. I will hopefully get this up on the Mexico Practice YouTube later today, and I'll put it up on the creativemediapractice.com website. And just a big thank you from everyone to Annette for spending some time with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And good luck.
Cool. I'm going to stop the recording.